Okay, yeah, I'm very, very excited to introduce my mother, Jewell Parker Rhodes. Her book, Black Brother, was published in the spring of this pandemic. And so she was not able to tour. It did not get the time and the space that it really deserves as just the wonderful work of art that it is. It's good. It's really good. It's a deeply personal work. And so I just wanted to ask you what inspired this amazing story?
Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, Kelly, my dear. Black Brother is my most personal book, and that it's inspired by several things. The first was the research that I did on Ghost Boys, where I discovered the school to prison pipeline, how children of color K through 12 are punished disproportionately, arrested by police officers, sent to juvenile hall. And once that happens to a child of color, they're more likely not to graduate from high school, and they're more likely to become part of the criminal prison system. So I wanted to address how wrong that was. So that's one thing. The second thing I wanted to address was colorism. As you can see, Kelly looks like her daddy, who happens to be a wondrous tall white guy who looks like a Norwegian Viking. And my son is brown, like me. And the world taught us, really so explicitly that even within the same family, racism and stereotyping could affect us and try to, destroy us as a family. Particularly for Evan, as he became 12 years old, schools, neighborhoods, all of a sudden started seeing him as the suspicious, stereotypical young Black man. And so there were actual moments when he very easily could have become part of the school to prison pipeline. And the third thing that I was writing about was representation, that Alexander Dumas is actually a French Black man. And when he was writing The Musketeers, he was writing about his father, the Black Count, who was one of the greatest fencers and generals in the Napoleon army. And yet no one knows about that, and how television and culture has made all those wonderful fencers white. And yet this is an opportunity, role models of sport that children of color can partake in. So it's a whole mixture, multi-layer of things that inspired Black Brother. And in that way, it makes it especially traumatic for me to have written it, and yet exciting to have it out in the world.
Well, I was so proud of you for having written this book, and I cried a river when I read it, of course. And just to give everyone a close-up of the cover, which I know you fought for this cover, to have this much color difference between these two brothers, very light-skinned, very dark-skinned, and this was our life. The school in this book, Middlefield Prep, is based on some real things that happened in our family. I went through this school first because I'm older than my brother, and they wanted me to give the graduation speech. They got all A's, such a good student, so sweet, so obedient, all of this. And then Evan shows up. And by then I was in college, but it was like, it was just, I couldn't believe the betrayal that they would treat him so differently because of the color of his skin. And my brother and I are actually a lot alike inside. And so just the way that skin color made all of that big of a difference, that stark of a difference in one family. This book captures it beautifully with Dante and Trey.
It also gets at that idea that genetically the children were the same, but one superficial characteristic determined outcomes from them. I remember giving birth to Kelly, and they had to take her for a procedure in the hospital. And when they brought her back to me, well, they didn't bring her back to me. They brought me a Black boy. It's like, where's my daughter? Where's my daughter? But the hospital had color coded us. And growing up, with Kelly, I was the nanny to the world at large. And then my husband was Evan's, adopted father. And we were a young starting family when I get so emotional, so excited. So forgive me if I'm not sounding so articulate, but it does bring back those moments when, as a young mom, there was the Rodney King beating, the Rodney King race rioting, and we were scared to death that Evan would grow and be assaulted as Rodney King was. And it's so ironic that he becomes a high schooler. We have to find 4 different high schools trying to find a place where he is seen as Evan and not seen as a stereotypical representation. And even right now, Evan is a graduate student in nursing at Johns Hopkins. I worry about him being in segregated Baltimore. And I also worry about him being a healthcare worker trying to do good and trying to survive a pandemic. The burden is really intense.
Absolutely. And just it's all what I love about this book is it takes place in the present day Black brother. So it's not like, we're not talking about ancient history, and we've all been reminded of this again. This history is still with us. Everything is still going on. It's still present. Actually, when I was in the hospital giving birth to my daughter, they asked me to disclose my race on a form, and I did not mention that I was mixed race because I had heard a rumor that they drug tested everyone who came through who was Black. So even if it potentially put my health at risk to not give them this information, I was not going to take the risk that something awful would go wrong. So all of this stuff, sometimes, we read books about the Black experience and they feel like ancient history, or we feel some kind of distance, but I think we've all been really reminded in this last month, there is no distance. We're right here. Yeah.
Absolutely. In Black Brother, it's 2 brothers, and one is Black presenting and one is white presenting, as my kids were. And so basically it's an exploration of the way that they're treated so differently. In Dante, the Black brother, as they bully and call him, Black brother, reducing him to a single characteristic, really comes out strong and aware of himself in a way in which would make anyone proud to have this young man, as your son or as a citizen in the US. So it's very special. But one of the things too I explored, which I don't speak for my children, but I do speak for how siblings, Dante and Trey, how they have to negotiate that. How the parents, the father gets privileges that his son will never have, how at times I felt just sort of like, oh my goodness, why don't we just complete the family, have a rainbow, and go move to a new country or found a new community. So while it's not about my kids, it is about how race can destroy, and racism can destroy a family and try to tear it apart. But in this book, the family holds together. And that's what I see about all of us right now in terms of the George Floyd murder. We are all trying to hold together. Now, Kelly's been asking me about my novel because yesterday I spoke a lot about her novel and she spoke, but I've got to shift, my dear. You're so generous with your time and such a wonderful lady. I want to hear you speak about Agnes at the End of the World, because I think it too is related to racism and oppression and patriarchy.
Yes, I in Agnes at the End of the World, it's the story of a 16-year-old girl who escapes from a fundamentalist polygamist cult. And when she escapes, she discovers that the world has been ravaged by a terrible pandemic. So, and actually in a weird kind of way, I think she's going through what a lot of teenagers are going through right now, which is they expected a world to be there for them after their graduation, and where is that world? And so I wrote the story, and I hope today just that it can empower teenagers, just to let them know that the world is not really going to end unless we let that happen. Like, this is a story of a young woman who goes from a victim of a cult, from an oppressed person, to the leader of a movement. And it's an inclusive, tolerant movement, pro-social justice. She takes back so much of what was stolen from her during her childhood. And she's actually rescued from this cult by a Black healthcare worker who's fighting a pandemic and still makes time to help get this girl out of a cult. Like, and so I just, yeah, I think about her a lot. And so it's a story that has, I hope, multiple resonances. Right now, I do think the focus on representation and seeing these beautiful books with covers of Black characters on them is extremely, extremely important. But yes, that's the story of my book.
Kelly, do you want to talk about us and our writing trajectory? I'll start with being scared, okay? And then you can follow on with me. I actually read lots of books, and all the books that I read were by white authors. And in fact, you know, I ended up getting a Doctor of Arts, and even still, I was never assigned a book by a writer of color. But when I was a kid, books gave me such empathy, and I did have myself filled up so much with hope and humanity that it really affected me and in some ways kept me alive. So I started writing my books too. And at the third grade, I wrote a book called The Last Scream. And of course, it ended in a scream. And I got to read it to my classmates, and I felt just tickled to death. But, you know, I never thought that I could have a career as a writer. I wrote all the time, but nobody ever said, Jewell, you can be a writer. I didn't see it as an opportunity. So I'm in college as a junior, and I go into the library and I see a book by a Black woman. And I'm ashamed to say, but this was how it was then, that I went, what? Black women write books? And I changed my major to English that very day and started writing. In my class, I was the only person of color, and students would ask me, Jewell, you know, why didn't you tell me your characters were Black? And I'd go, well, why didn't you tell me your characters were white? And that's when I learned that I had learned to read white. And it was just such a disturbing thought. And also, Kelly, like Agnes's world, I had learned to read that a lot of the writers were males. That if you were going to be a great writer, you would have that patriarchal oppression also. So I struggled for a long time to write. And I had wrote Voodoo Dreams. It had gotten 13 rejections. I was going to give up, and then I gave birth to Kelly. And Kelly was in a crib by my office because we shared it. And looking at her as my daughter, I felt, how can I tell her to achieve her dreams if I give up? And literally, she gave me the strength to be creative again, to go back into my book and write. As it was, it took 3 years for Voodoo Dreams to be published. And I would get letters from editors in New York saying, well, we can't buy this book because everybody knows Black people don't read books. So hasn't the world changed? Kelly, why don't you take it from there?
Well, and I just want to say that I grew up in a household seeing this Black woman writing every single day, and I wanted to be just like her. And so I was writing all the time, and I was babysat by her MFA students who were also Black women writers. So to me, it seemed like the most natural possible course, that was just the way that we were. We spoke, we sang, we wrote books, and I am eternally grateful for that. Read books, yes. I'm eternally grateful for that example. But not all children growing up now have that. And so that's why I think bringing in more diverse books, as many as you can, to middle schools, high schools, is extremely important. And I just want to really quick recommend Bethany Morrow's A Song Below Water for YA fiction, A Song of Grace and Ruins by Roseanne Brown, and You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. These are 3 books that just came out last week. So if you're looking to bring that representation into your classroom, it made all the difference to me, because I didn't struggle with that self-doubt the way that my mother had to. And it made my path so much easier, and we can continue to make kids' paths easier. And so actually, I've been wanting to ask you, Jewell, what do you hope that people who see themselves in Dante, children who see themselves in Dante, might take away from your story?
You know, one of the phrases that I used in Ghost Boys is that everyone needs their story to be felt and to be heard. So when I see school kids, it's like, wow, write your stories. And they're encouraged by seeing diverse characters. And even now I see this wave of new writers coming who are changing and having an impact. One of the things that I do worry about is how poverty still affects the access to books. I didn't have books. We were too poor, and teachers and librarians were always there to feed me books, about that showed characters like me would have been also as welcome, because all books, teach empathy, and teach a child about the world. But those of you that are teachers, librarians, really reach out to kids and give them that book. And I just got to say, because I say it all the time, if you ever need books, contact me, because I remember not having books when I was a kid. And if it weren't for teachers and librarians supporting me, I wouldn't be who I am today. And not only that, Kelly wouldn't be Kelly as she is today. And my daughter's daughter, Clara, wouldn't be who she is today. So being a teacher and a librarian and a bookseller is powerful.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to, as a follow-up to that, that was a beautiful answer and so true. What about the Treys? What do you hope that they take away from this story?
Oh, Trey is the brother who presents as being black and black brother. And one of the things that Trey learns, instead of becoming just a victim of bullying, instead of, he does rail and he has to go to court because he was arrested unfairly. But he learns that the best way to defeat the bullying and the racism is for him to have more self-love, more self-esteem. And he says to himself and he says to the readers, be you, even if others can't see you, be you. And the problem of seeing, and not seeing the glory of children of color is the bias that's in some people's minds. And the children of color have to be reminded, and Trey reminds them that they are beautiful. And in fact, at the end of the novel, they exchange t-shirts that say Heritage is Lit. And I've actually sent out hundreds of t-shirts that say Heritage is Lit, because I want everyone to celebrate that we are all a mixed blood stew. All of our heritages are important, and we all should be proud to be who we are. And being who we are, we won't feel the need to oppress anybody else. So there, right? Should we?
Well, I would just tell you really quickly, one thing I took away from Trey too, as being the lighter presenting child, is how important it is, number one, to acknowledge how much privilege the color of your skin gives you, which is something that you don't always realize as a kid. I honestly didn't always realize when even growing up next to my brother, and then also, I think anti-passing is really important right now. Like, if someone says something, if you're light enough to pass and someone says something behind you in the grocery store, it's like these days I turn around so fast, because it's just like, nope, you can't do this. There are more of us out here than you think. So standing up when you can, when it's safe for you, that's a message that I took from Trey too, and the way he supported his brother in this story.
Oh, that's so beautiful, Kelly. If you think about it, just from the Harlem Renaissance, there were all those stories about people of color passing, passing in order to live a better life. Think how much more helpful and hopeful it is that we have a generation of young men and women who, even if they could, quote, pass, won't, because they aren't victims. They are just proud, beautiful human beings as much as anyone else. And in fact, there's a study called the Humanist Project. You'll see a reference to it in the back of my book, where this woman photographer has documented that there are over 4,000 skin tones. The variety of colors within the human community are just remarkable. And right now, all of us, no matter what shade we are like, ooh, being proud, and I love it. So questions. You can tell I'm the goofier one. I'm the one who never quite grew up.
I can't even say how how much I'm just enjoying listening to you both right now. I just got really absorbed and was also going to just post a link to, there's a new edition of Passing by Noah Larson, speaking of the Harlem Renaissance, that we have available at the store. So hold up, folks. I'm going to link to that book for you to check that out. And Kelly, we had a question a minute ago, and I'm going to take notes while you talk, to repeat the 3 books that you recommended earlier. And I was not keeping up, so I also want to paste those titles and links for folks in our chat. So if you could repeat those.
Yes, A Song Below Water by Bethany Morrow. It's about, it's set in Portland, and it's about Black mermaids. So it doesn't get any better than that for YA
Awesome.
literature.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's You Should See Me in a Crown, which is Black and LGBTQIA positive. It's by Leah Johnson, and that book, I read it on Friday. It'll turn a bad mood into a good mood so fast. I mean, it was so uplifting and so joyful. So if you want to make space for some Black joy, turn to that book. And then A Song of Race and Ruin by Roseanne Brown is just, it's an epic, African-inspired YA fantasy that you can just sink into. And speaking of passing, actually, I haven't read this one yet, but my eye is out for The Vanishing Half, which came out recently. Okay. And I'm blanking on her name right now. But if that's something that interests you, yeah.
And Kelly also mentioned your next book, Mirror Girls.
Yes, my next book, sorry to plug really quickly, it's a YA historical fiction set in the Jim Crow South, and it's about 2 twins, one who's dark and one who's lighter, and they're sisters. They're separated at birth after their parents are murdered by the police. And when they find each other again, they go on a hunt to discover what happened in this town. And so this book, hopefully the announcement will be out soon and everything, but
now, and I'm sure all of you too know, for the MG, for the MG audience, we have wonderful writers, Brandy Colbert, Jason Reynolds, Varian Johnson, Rita Williams Garcia, Kayson's actually YA, Kayson Calendar's YA, and you get those later, Stephanie, but I actually want you to know that I always wanted to write for youth. I think that's the best, highest art form ever. And I actually spent almost 3 decades writing books for adults, trying to become good enough to write for kids. So my career as an MG author, which is the best moment of my life ever, began with Ninth Ward, writing about Hurricane Katrina and how race and class and gender also created hardship, and then moving on through various other books, including my Black Mermaid book, Value Magic, for middle graders, which is about the BP oil spill, which happened shortly after Hurricane Katrina. But moving forward, I also believe in bringing bits and pieces of African-American history to children's lives. And Ghost Boys, I'm sure you might know, talks about Emmett Till, because it's interesting, I was a youngster when Emmett Till was murdered. And then my son, during the Rodney King riots and all the subsequent murders, and then Tamir Rice, and this is inspired by Tamir Rice's murder, and then George Floyd. This is a great intro for middle graders to understand all the historical links and connections between the murder of young boys of color as well as young men. And then, of course, my novel, Black Brother.
And I would like to say, as we wait for more questions to come in, I'd like to get back to something Kelly said a moment ago about Black joy, and just put in a plug, because I know a lot of people are hankering for books that are specific to anti-racism and police reform, and looking at injustice very closely to educate themselves, which is wonderful. But I also want to say how important it is to just read books, and for kids, I think, I'm not speaking as a parent, but I'm just going to say this, and for kids of all races to just read books about Black kids being kids, right? Just because, like you, Jewell, I grew up reading all the stories I read about white people, and they were just you know, and the kids' books I read were just white kids being white kids, right? But I didn't see stories about people who I could identify with more closely just being kids. And so it's very important, I think, especially particularly important for Black children and
Absolutely.
parents of Black children in particular, but also for parents of white children.
You know,
Your kids need to read books about Black kids being kids. I'm just going to throw that out there.
I couldn't agree more. And actually in Ghost Boys, you know, the main character is dead and has to say, you know, bear witness to empower other kids to be active for social justice. But Black Brother, and I probably didn't make enough of a mention about this, is a sports book. I can't believe I wrote a sports book. So it's kind of like a Karate Kid story where he learns how to become a fencer, that he learns that whole, you know, healing of sports. And in fact, it is based on another story that for years, fencers have been primarily, you know, white, you know, and particularly the American Olympic team. But in the Brazilian Olympics, the fencers, there were 6 biracial or African-American men and women who went on to medal in the Brazilian Olympic fencing. So it also talks about how on guard and he wins. And so for that triumphant moment of, yes, the underdog in terms of fencing skill, but certainly the equal person in terms of using the strategy, the intellect of being a kid and figuring out how to win athletically. So it does uplift.
Yes, I'll say, so Kwame Alexander, for instance,
Yes.
does that. I don't want to try to list people because I know I'll miss some people, but just overall, just, you know, there are just great stories out there. And, you know, if you, you know, encounter someone who it just doesn't occur to them to pick up a story about a Black kid for their white child, just ask them how many books they think Black kids are reading about white children and see if that doesn't, flip a switch. Because I think that's
a great organization for lists too. And I just want to say, just because I'm kind of plugged into like the debuts coming out in the next year, we're going to see some in YA, some amazing, like super fun Black rom-coms, like things that are just like, you know, like You've Got Mail, but like for us, you know, it's just, I'm really, really excited. So you are going to see, I think, more and more joy as the year goes on, but an organization that does keep great lists that I'm sure you're aware of is We Need Diverse Books. They have done such a good job of representing a full spectrum of all of the humanity that is contained in any given diverse person. I mean, because we are more than just our trauma. And I remember being a child too, and I would read a lot of white writers, especially in fantasy, because sometimes I just couldn't take the constant trauma of the heavier stuff. And you need both.
Connected to that too, I love Project Lit community. So Project Lit will put out a list of like 26 books every year, and Project Lit clubs all across the nation read these books. And it's a great spattering of, you know, middle grade as well as YA books that are diverse and just absolutely wonderful. So check out Project Lit. And one of the reasons why I also wanted to be a writer, and I make a difference. I write for children. Yes, because I love it. But I particularly think the highest honor is when my books are in the classroom. So I write for teachers because I think great teachers can amplify the messages of a book and really make the connections that need to be made. But I saw Kelly go through 5th and 6th grade, Evan go through 5th and 6th grade. And in terms of February Black History Month, they were still reading the same book by Margaret Diller, great book, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, but the same book all the time. So my own personal mission is that I want more books, my books too, in classrooms so that there isn't one book, one author who carries Black history on her shoulders every February.
Absolutely, and different genres too. Like I still remember the summer that I asked you, like, why don't Black people write science fiction? Like I was looking for Black sci-fi and you were like, wait, check yourself, Octavia Butler. Like, but those books were never given to me in schools. You know, it was like, if I hadn't heard it from you, and Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower is the biggest inspiration for Agnes at the End of the World. I don't know where I would be as a person without her. And so just, you know, speak the names of these authors who are doing different types of stories, not just the contemporary social justice issues.
And actually, it's very interesting. I was part of the generation of young assistant professors who fought for African American studies, women's studies, ethnic literature to be in the university academy. And most of us were self-taught because we didn't have classes. But then we go on to teach classes. And right now I teach ethnic literature for Arizona State. So where I went from knowing nothing to learning, it was a privilege then to be able to share that with my kids. So it's like step by step, we can make the world more embracing as long as we allow everyone's stories to be heard. Another question, Stephanie?
Yeah, I love that, more embracing. I think that's a great idea, especially now when we might be starved a little bit for actual embraces. To think about, you know, how we can embrace concepts and people in other ways. So thank you for that. So have a specific book question for you, Jewell, since you're an educator.
Yes.
Would you mind talking about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and how you would teach that book to diverse students, and what your
I'm
views might be on it now?
I'm assuming you would be talking high school, college.
Yeah, older kids.
Yes, Invisible Man actually was the core inspiration in a way for the narrative strategy of Black Brother, Black Brother.
Mm-hmm.
My opening line is, I wish I were invisible.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole, I am the invisible man in the basement, and having to make yourself visible to the world, and how much harder it was for him. But Invisible Man, I think, I think that book is absolutely fantastic. And I think in terms of teaching it, the beginning portions of that book and the whole idea of visibility, invisibility, the whole idea of double consciousness, of how a Black person has to be aware of not only their own identity, but how people who are non-Black see themselves, are really ripe for discussion. I also think that the information regarding, you know, the movement, the Back to Africa movement, the Marcus Garvey and others, you know, the sort of the activism is really awesome and powerful. But I don't know who asked that question. You know, it's been a while since I've taught Invisible Man, and I would love to be your personal guide for any other teaching. So I would love to go back and reread that book again, help develop questions, and I would be happy to do that for you. One of the things that I find a little bit more approachable, at least for high school students, is Richard Wright's Native Son. You know, the whole idea of how sexuality and race, you know, have caused the sort of have caused the lynching of Black people, and how the male image of being this sort of oversexed character so pervades our world historically. And I think that also leads to the reason that we have this biases, that people know that when social scientists know that when people look at children of color, that's why they see Tamir Rice, but they see him as this threatening man, or they see a big Black man and all of a sudden he's even bigger than big. He's a giant, so you need 5 police officers to leap and jump on him. And I think Native Son shows how, you know, even in the Black community, he is warned, brutally so, of how a white person's gaze can kill you, and how that tracks and trails as he gets older and older. I think that would contrast greatly with more optimistic books that are optimistic in the sense that the kid takes away the power of those who gaze at him, and instead feels his own power as an individual. And I think that that's what Black Brother does. Trey does what in Native Son, the character couldn't do. But Ellison's Invisible Man, I'm down with that. And if you are going to teach it, I'll also teach it with my ethnic literature class coming up this year. And maybe we can have some joint discussions and really dig into it, because it is an important book, but it is a masterpiece and has lots in it that I need to refresh myself on.
Thank you so much, Jewell. Yeah, what a what a great answer, and just talking about so many important things, and about what literature has to offer to everyone, and thanks to we had some other people chime in about Native Son as well to recognize. Yeah.
I don't know if you read it before the question, Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston was a revolution. Their eyes were watching God, you know. But I also, if you look at her life and her own statements, she was the first to literally come out and say, I'm not going to write about being tragically colored. You know, she showed joy. And guys, women, men, there are so many like videos and movies. Like there's a movie of Zora Neale Hurston's life that's absolutely wonderful, that has all these tall tales. So ethnic literature, you know, and not only of African American, I've got so many resources. So from the bottom of my heart, because I've been to North Carolina, I love the community and I love giving back. If I can be of service, I mean that very sincerely, let me know. And I've got great resources.
Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate that. And I know that there are multiple educators on the call, so thank you. And we do have a couple more questions as well. And I will say that Zora Neale Hurston, I Love Myself When I Am Laughing, was just reissued with the original, or at least a very early cover. And that's something that Malaprop carries, and something that I read many years ago. Really appreciate. And even though, you know, in her own story, and of course she's from North Carolina.
Yeah.
For anyone who,
right.
Who didn't know. And so I've got a couple more questions. So for Jewell, where did the inspiration for Carlos's character in Ghost Boys come from? I think you alluded to this earlier, but you might.
Oh, no, for in Ghost Boys, I didn't want to write the book, and it took me 2.5 years, and things came out in pieces. And I had the character Jerome. I had the character later of Sarah, the young white girl, the daughter of the police officer who can see Jerome. I, of course, had Emmett Till. He was the key that unlocked everything. But about 1.5 years, I was at a library conference, and my editor said, Jewell, where did, you know, Jerome get the gun? And I went, oh, yeah, that's right. Where did he get it? And I went to sleep in one of those, you know, Hilton hotels, had nightmares, and woke up, and there was Carlos. I think the fact that I was living in California had something to do with it, but also from writing way back, I had studied how, particularly in terms of the African American traditions or religious traditions, the commonalities. So the Hispanic communities, its idea of the Day of the Dead, you know, does fit with, you know, the idea that, you know, every goodbye ain't gone in the Black community, that spirits are alive, does fit with the Catholic tradition, you know, that there are spirits, does fit with the Vietnamese tradition, that there are ancestors. And so that Carlos, African American and Hispanic, came together. But in all my middle grade novels, I try to have multi-ethnic. So in characters in Ninth Ward, we have Vietnamese characters. You know, Ghost Boys has, you know, the Hispanic character Carlos. But actually, the novel was done. It was already in a ARC, advanced reading copy. And I had another moment where when Carlos tells his dad that he was the one who gave Jerome the gun, there's this moment where I had missed the fact that the father would look at Carlos and realize, son, you could have been killed. So it was also a moment in, you know, I added this back into the finished version of the book, that you don't have to necessarily be just African American. You can be Hispanic American. I learned from writing Towers Spaulding, you can be Muslim American, that you can be a person of color from any, you know, sort of ethnic heritage background and still be subject to abuse because of isms.
I just wanted to say really quickly, and I'm so sorry because that's perfect, but the magical realism that you see in many different types of diverse writing. Like there's a way in which we've all been taught to read white books in school, and they tend not to weave in magic in quite exactly the same way. The ghosts don't have the same resonances. And so I think as we're all learning to embrace more diverse literature, learning how to read magical realism, learning how to understand these ghosts and how connected marginalized peoples feel with their ancestry is going to be a really important thing for all of us. That it's just, I want to see people being able to read these books with more ease, because I remember being in college reading Their Eyes Were Watching God, and most of the white people in that class didn't finish the book. It was like, couldn't read it, wasn't legible to me, but we can start teaching, like we can make these books more legible if we talk about things like this magic and where it comes from and why it's so important.
Yes, and particularly with great Toni Morrison's Beloved, magic, I would throw out the term magical realism. It comes from this very specific, Latin American tradition. Interestingly enough, the beginning of Ghost Boys, with the character being dead, comes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where the character is dead. And that gave me that way to approach that book. But my grandmother was a hoodoo lady. And she taught me about ghosts and spirits, scratch the wall, somebody died, dreams have meaning. And that's just sort of second nature to me. And even though she's been dead for 30 years, she's part of my life. When I started writing Ninth Ward and about New Orleans with its ghosts and spirits, I didn't realize that for some adults, they found the book off-putting because they were thinking, ghosts as in this sort of Christian negative tradition. And I'm thinking elders, ancestors, spirits. If you go on my website, you'll find in the Educator's Guide for Ghost Boys information about spirits. Also, in terms of writing, I do know how to write standard English, okay? But my tone, my voice of writing comes from an oral, tradition. And I consider, for the most part, that I am writing using African-American narrative strategies so that kids don't have to wait until college to learn about the difference of how culture affects narrative. So I would appreciate it if more teachers and librarians and ask me to Skype or talk about how my books are different. And for the longest time, I had copy editors who would cross out, no, you can't do it like that. This makes a whole sentence. And I'd have to say, no, leave it alone. I am writing from the porch. That's a great slave who carried culture in the stories that they tell. That's how I'm trying to write for middle graders today.
I think that's so important for young people, for everyone, to just hear different voices and different ways of presenting in the world, so that we don't have the sense that there's a right, normal, neutral standard.
Yes. Toni Morrison called that the master narrative, that we just in the reading, the language is a master narrative. And so being able to talk about all kinds of narratives and how culture influences them, it's as basic, and that's why I always have food in my books. Food across cultures, it's still heartwarming, wonderful food, and with tremendous, lovely differences. So too, how we tell stories and what stories we tell.
I have another question, and I think this is referring to Black Brother. Amy, type in the chat if I have that wrong. But the question is, I understand this is a middle grade book. How do you think this would work in high school classes?
I think it would work, particularly say 9th grade high school, possibly 10th grade high school. But I do know that because I'm writing from the oral tradition, that a lot of high school teachers with struggling readers say that my books are critical and key. I know that historically, in terms of literacy, we still have problems in poor communities, and communities of color regarding literacy. So one of the things is that my books do go across a lot of reading abilities, but the topics are for older kids. And so rather than having somebody who has difficulty reading about, Jack and Jill, they're still reading and learning about things that matter to their life. So at least that's, the word that I have from readers. But I would go 9th and 10th grade, but definitely 9th grade. The kids are 14. Trey is 16 and his brother Dante is 14.
Excellent. It looks like we have another question. Let me just catch up a little bit. So speaking from your point, Jewell, about cultural narratives, how would that parlay into writing instruction for middle grade students? Those would be valuable and important lessons that affect student writing and reading. Thank you.
Oh my goodness.
I don't know if that's too big for the call, but it's a good question.
I did write a book called Fiction Lessons for Black Authors that use the African American tradition for explaining creative writing. And I have another book for nonfiction and how the slave narrative, Frederick Douglass, influences memoir narrative today. So I would start there. But again, this is like fun. You're gonna have to invite me to your class. We're gonna have to get on the telephone and make a call. Here's an example. Exaggeration of writing. Exaggeration is a big deal in African American culture. The tall tale, the tall stories. I remember one student who was writing a story about their birthday and their birthday cake, and the story kept getting more outrageous and outrageous. And they had a white teacher, and the teacher said, "You're lying. This doesn't make any sense," and basically tossed their paper. When in fact, they were telling the story the way, that their community would have told it. So I think that just critical difference of hearing, well, why did you tell it that way? Or how else can you tell it? Or how would your grandparent tell you this story? And grandparents are special. I think that might be a great entryway. So not just how we would tell it with standard English or that 5-point essay, and that's another question in another time for discussion, but ask them, how would the people that how would they tell you the story? I think that might open up ideas.
Also, this book for any.
Oh, yes. Oh,
I love it. The Creativity Project.
That's made for you.
It's fantastic. Yeah.
See, my daughter, wonderful.
I got your back. Yeah.
Yes, the Creativity Project is absolutely, by Colby Sharp, is geared towards middle grade students and has examples from diverse writers and prompts for diverse writing. Go ahead, girl. Another question.
Excellent.
I have one for Kelly. Go ahead.
I actually have one for Kelly, and I just wanted to ask you, because obviously you grew up with a writer. And I know that from reading about you, that you've been writing since you were very young. And I wonder just about your writing process and where you find inspiration and how the way you write has maybe changed over the years.
That's, thank you for that question. It's an amazing thing happened. My mother had always told me this story that, about writing her first book. She wrote it when she was 33, and she dedicated it to me.
That was when it got published. Go ahead.
That was when it got published, but she wrote it right. Yeah, and she, right, because it took 7 years to write that one. Yeah, and that I was her motivation, and that she said having a daughter, gave her this big boost. She talked a little bit about that. I actually accidentally wrote my first book when I was a teenager, and it just kind of came pouring out of me during high school. It's called Doormat. It still exists in the world. Then I spent my 20s trying to figure out how to write a novel again. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't recapture whatever that natural thing was that I had tapped into. And then I got pregnant with my daughter. And I got pregnant. I was living in Honolulu at the time, and we were hearing about the Zika epidemic. So that's how a pandemic found its way into my book, because I got that first little glimmer of how fast life can change. it was like having a daughter just gave me a reason to tell stories. And I wish that I could tell my 20-year-old self, and I tell younger writers, you know, be patient, like wait until you have a story you really need to tell. Don't just write. I mean, certainly practice if it gives you joy, but don't just write because you want to have a novel published or because that's important to your sense of self-worth. Wait for that story because it's worth it. It's worth it.
It's interesting, the opening of Voodoo Dreams, my first novel, which took 7 years to write, there's a phrase that women hand sight down through the generations, and sight as in seer, sight. Women hand sight down through the generations, mother to daughter. My grandmother handed down to me, and then handing down to Kelly. So I think in terms of my community, being a mother, being an elder, spurred creativity. And that's not the Western narrative. You know, everybody says, oh, you're gonna have a kid, you'll be too busy, or that only males can be writers. And I think we all should take that power back and say, no, having families, we can still tell stories. And in fact, they're an asset.
Gives us the reason to write. And I also think that very destructive myth of the selfish male writer, you know, the whole household revolves around, you know, whoever it is, Robert Frost and his work, and putting it up on this pedestal. I actually have found more inspiration, you know, being down in the sandbox with my daughter than any place else on earth. Yeah, so.
Any final questions, Stephanie?
Yeah, it looks, I don't think I'm missing anyone. Holler really quick if I have missed any questions that were posted. I also realize it's 4 o'clock. I, for one, would actually like to take a whole other hour to just talk about feminism and patriarchy as well. But I don't think we should test anyone's stamina that way. I am just so grateful to both of you for sharing space and time with us today, and for everyone on the call for joining us today. We had a question earlier about whether or not there'll be a recording. For those who joined us late, there will be a recording. It will be posted on the Malaprop's YouTube channel at a later date. I've got the sign-up list for this event, and so when that's available, I'll go ahead and email everyone and let you know when you can view that if you had to miss something. And then a reminder as well that if you're a local educator here in Asheville-Buncombe County, email me, stephanie@malaprops.com, for a chance to get a free Skype visit from the authors. And I can't see that everyone who emails me will get a visit. It's but we'll see how many we get and go from there.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll see.
Can I add? I have the free educational resources, and on YouTube I read chapter 1 of Ghost Boys, but I also put up a PSA video where they have young middle grade students talking about police violence, and it's really powerful. And I have resources for all my books, Hurricane Katrina, on fencing, so anything I can do to help. And I just have 2 dogs. I don't have I don't have a 3-year-old. So Kelly, you take care of Clara, and you're doing a marvelous, magnificent job. And that means I can help teachers. So don't think that I don't ever want to hear from you. And if you can't get me, email me again or go through my website. But I do want to hear from you. But it's my own sort of special thank you to what women and men just like you did for me when I was a little girl. So I honor them through you. And then when I'm gone, I'm such a goofball. I'm a noodle. Kelly will carry on, and Clara will be writing her stories. So go women, go power, go all of us. Thank you, Malaprops.
Thank you so much, Jewell. I'm just really, I'm really touched. Kelly, any final words from you?
Oh, no, I just want to thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And I'm not as seasoned or experienced, but I know that a lot of high schools and a lot of students at home, and there might be students at home again in the fall. And I haven't had a ton of practice, but I would give it my best shot for y'all anytime. Yeah, and my book is about faith and hope, so I hope that that has something to offer. And please buy Black Brother, Black Brother. It's marvelous.
And buy Agnes at the End of the World. And when you go back to school and you need a classroom set, give a holler. Okay? I don't give away birthday or Christmas presents or any of that. I say, oh, I'm donating books in your name. So I've got a ton of Kelly's books and a ton of my books, which I would love for you to give and put in the hands of students.
Absolutely, and we will be doing that thanks to you. Thank you so much, Jewell and Kelly, and to everyone here. This has just been amazing and in a lot of ways healing and edifying, and I really appreciate it. Everyone, yeah, get in touch if you're an educator, and we'll post the video later. And I just wish health and safety to everyone out there, and thank you so much for supporting us as a bookstore and other indies and Black-owned bookstores and Black-owned businesses in general. Throw that in there as well. Thanks so much, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye. Bye.